Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we continue our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Today, as I report, it appears that Ukrainian forces were able to strike various targets in the Russian-captured city of Melitopol. Some folks are saying that this could have possibly been the first strike by the U.S.-supplied small diameter bomb launched from a HIMARS system. Probably unlikely. More likely than not, this was a strike by a HIMARS or quite possibly a Ukrainian system. So we do know that the Ukrainians possess the Smerch, a Soviet origin multiple launch rocket system. Now the Ukrainians have upgraded those Smerch systems that give them more range than when they were first developed. And in all probability, that is probably what we have seen hit Melitopol. And again, I wouldn't put Melitopol outside of the range of traditional HIMARS rocket systems, depending on how the missile was launched, the altitude of the firing system. It's difficult to say. And then obviously these systems are being pushed day in and day out just to see exactly the type of range or extended range these systems can actually accomplish. So you look at the specifications for said missile, but obviously it could be much longer than what those specifications actually say. In other news, we are hearing reports now that the Ukrainians are now actively using a French system in the war. It's called the Akeron, MMP. This is much like an Israeli Spike. It has the ability to hit targets in a fire and forget mode. And it also has a man-in-the-loop mode that acts much like a Spike missile where you fire the system, the missile goes up to apogee, and then you can control via a missile eyes view of that system through a fiber optic cable. And that is one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced, anti-tank weapon system in the French military. And those systems are now being handed over to the Ukrainians. How many of the Akerons have been handed over? Difficult to say, but we do know that that system is now being deployed against Russian forces. And that kind of gives us an idea on why, again, it's so difficult for the Russians to maneuver. There are a vast array of anti-tank guided missiles that are now being used by the Ukrainians. And just to name a few, obviously you now have the Akeron, you have the Milan, you have the To-2, you have the Javelin, you have the Stunka of Ukrainian origin, you have the In-Law. There is just a wide range of these anti-tank guided weapons that are being used. And even the Starstreak. I understand that the Starstreak is being used, which traditionally is a anti-aircraft weapon, but the Ukrainians are using the Starstreak in a ground attack mode, and they're engaging vehicles with the Starstreak among other systems, and thousands of these systems have been delivered, and this is what is making it difficult to see maneuver warfare, especially on the part of Russian forces. Again, we saw it early in the conflict when the invasion first started, the use of these systems that just wreaked havoc upon Russian columns. And at the same time, we are starting to see the Russians deploy new systems. I have heard reports of a new mine that the Russians are using. It is an acoustic based mine in which you can set the mine off of a roadway, say up to 100 meters, and the mine detects the acoustic signature of a vehicle, so it can identify if it is a tracked vehicle or not. Once that mine, this Russian mine, identifies it as a tracked vehicle, it then launches a very, very short-range munition into the air, and that munition then does a top attack of said vehicle. So it's not a traditional mine in respect to a vehicle rolls over the mine and then the mine detonates. This specific mine is an acoustic sensor, senses the vehicle on the roadway or even over the ground, and then launches a top attack, short range, almost like a missile, that then comes down and destroys the target by hitting the weakest point of the armor, which is indeed the top of the vehicle. So very interesting as the war continues to change and we see more and more systems being deployed by both Russia and the Ukrainians. Now, we're continuing to hear about China and the possibility that China could be delivering lethal weapon systems to the Russians. What would that look like? What systems could the Chinese hand over to the Russians that the Russians do not already have? Well, that's a good question I just asked myself, and you may be asking yourself as well. For Russian supporters, this is going to be fairly difficult to hear. And the reason I say that is Chinese technology, depending on what technology you are looking at, is ahead of Russian technology. Not only that, in some cases, Chinese doctrine, Western doctrine, that the Chinese have adopted, especially in the use of its aircraft, ground attack rules specifically, using targeting pods, are ahead of the Russians. For instance, the Chinese have a multi-role ground attack jet fighter, multi-role fighter aircraft. It is called the J-16. It looks and is based off of the Russian Su-30. Now, what is different about the J-16 than, say, a Russian Su-30? Well, it's avionics and it's the sensor package. The Russians may be ahead of the Chinese in terms of jet propulsion and jet engines that the Russians have supplied the Chinese in the past. Now, the Chinese are getting better at these engines, but more importantly, the Chinese weapon systems, precision-guided weapon systems, and more importantly, the sensor packages in those aircraft, such as the J-16, are more advanced than what the Russians are fielding. The Russians have still not mass adopted targeting pods. And I've talked about this before, and folks are probably getting tired of me saying this, but it is a weapon system that the Russians absolutely need to deploy. And they have not deployed very many of them. There is an internal targeting pod. It's not really a targeting pod, it's a targeting system that's on the Su-34 fullback. And they're using theirs, and it's relatively effective. And that's really the only targeting system, more advanced targeting system, that's being used on Russian aircraft right now. Now, the Chinese are using these actual targeting pods, much like the sniper or lantern type systems, specifically the sniper. That system, or the Chinese version of that system, is pretty good. Obviously, it's not as good as American systems in terms of ability and capabilities. But nonetheless, those systems, especially deployed in a combat zone, the likes of which we're seeing in Ukraine, where you have to have that standoff capability. And that's what the Chinese could possibly help Russia. The Chinese could either A, hand over the J-16, and more importantly, those targeting pods that are equipped on these J-16s. But again, also the avionics. If you look at the cockpit of, say, a J-16, go ahead and do it. Look up a J-16 cockpit, and then compare and contrast that with the cockpit of, say, a Russian Su-30 or an Su-34. Obviously, the Chinese are ahead in that area. Now, on the Su-57, probably a little bit different, and we're starting to see the Russians make advances and make headway. But not on a large scale. You're probably looking at best 10 Su-57s being deployed against the Ukrainians, whereas the Chinese have hundreds of these J-16s. I believe right now they number in excess of 240 to possibly up to 300 J-16s have now been deployed by the Chinese. And again, it's just not the J-16. There are J-20s, there are J-10s, and all these systems, thousands of them, that are being used by the Chinese, all have the ability to use more advanced targeting pods, which means that the Chinese aircraft can stay out of the range of some of these medium range air defense systems. And they can also fly at altitude, at distance, and then use these systems to launch standoff GPS or GLONASS guided weapon systems, bombs, against targets on the ground, or even better, standoff long-range missiles. And when I mean standoff, the aircraft is firing its missile at a ground target 100, 200 miles from the target it wishes to hit. That gives that pilot, again, the ability to stay out of that surface-to-air missile envelope. Now, there are some systems, maybe the S-300 that the Ukrainians are using, that could reach out and touch high-altitude aircraft such as those. But in regards to the front lines that we're seeing right now, again, operations near Bakhmut, Sloviansk, further to the south near Volhodar, those systems that the Chinese have would be incredibly valuable to the Russians. That would mean the Russians would have the ability to look for targets many, many miles away from the front line and then engage those targets. So again, I would say that would be one system. Maybe the J-16, maybe retrofitting Su-30s, Su-35s, Su-34s with these targeting pods that could help the Russians in some of these standoff attack missions. Now, other systems that the Chinese have are the ballistic missiles, very, very precise GPS guided ballistic missiles. It's not GPS guided, but the Chinese version of GPS, which is like the Russian GLONASS. And the Chinese have many other advanced systems as well, but probably at least what is actively being used by the Russians that the Chinese are giving the Russians is satellite intelligence. The Chinese are now ahead of the Russians in terms of surveillance satellites. Satellites that have the ability to search for targets on the ground and then give that information to its armed forces. And the Chinese right now are probably second only to the United States in satellites that have been deployed for military sensing purposes. So that is one area right now where the Chinese are probably assisting the Russians. At the same time, we could probably see the Chinese hand over munitions. Some of the artillery pieces that the Russian use, that the Chinese could also assist the Russians in manufacturing and handing over those munitions for Russian artillery. We could see that as well. But really, it's technology. The Chinese right now have a larger defense budget than Russia, and have the ability and are continuing to have the ability to produce and field more advanced pieces of weapon technology. And we'll probably see at some point, in the very not too distant future, we will finally see some of that technology provided by the Chinese handed over to the Russians. So we're continuing to watch the battlefield. Not a lot has changed in the last few days. Again, it is an artillery slugfest with masses of infantry fighting it out near Bakhmut and other areas as well. But we'll continue to monitor, we'll continue to report as things change on the ground, and you'll hear it first here, so stay tuned. Thanks for joining us today. More to come. Have a good day.